Nia had exactly 3 seconds to make a choice that would either save her or get her killed. She could stay quiet and watch the mean lady, Yuna, poison the boss. Or, she could do something so crazy it would make every heart in the room stop. Nia took a deep breath, stepped into the light, and grabbed the most dangerous man in the city. She kissed Sung right in front of 200 angry men with guns. Crash. Glass smashed everywhere. Click. The guards pointed their heavy black guns right at Nia's head. Beverly Cooper's camera flashed like a bomb going off, catching the exact moment Nia ruined the biggest wedding of the year. Nia was shaking so hard she could feel her bones rattling. She knew she was in big trouble. But as she kissed him, she pushed a tiny secret note into Sung's hand. She whispered into his ear, "Don't drink the wine. Yuna is trying to kill you." The guards grabbed Nia's hair and slammed her to her knees. They looked like they were going to end her life right then and there. Nia looked up at Sung with tears in her eyes. She had just started a war, and she was the only one standing in the middle of it. Hey family, before this story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comments fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. And Happy New Year to every single one of you. Let's start this year with a story that will keep you glued till the very end. 3 seconds. That was all the time Nia had before the world turned into a nightmare of lead and shattered glass. Her tray wobbled as she watched Yuna tilt a silver vial over Sung's crystal flute. One sip and the king of the city would be a corpse before the cake was cut. Nia's lungs seized, the air turning into jagged glass in her chest. She could run and let him die, or she could step into the crosshairs. If she stayed silent, she was a ghost. If she spoke, she was a target. Nia lunged. She didn't scream a warning. She grabbed Sung's silk lapels and smashed her lips against his. The room died. No one breathed. Then came the crunch of 100 safety catches clicking off. The heat from Sung's skin was a shock, but the cold steel of a dozen gun barrels pressing against her skull was a promise. She felt the heavy weight of the micro SD card in her palm and shoved it into Sung's hand. "Don't drink," she hissed against his mouth, her voice a jagged thread. "Yuna wants you dead." The guards didn't wait for orders. A giant hand twisted into Nia's hair, yanking her head back until her neck burned. She was slammed onto the marble, her knees cracking against the floor like dry wood. Yuna's face was a mask of beautiful, murderous rage, her red lips curling as she pointed a finger at Nia's heart. Sung stood like a statue carved from ice, his eyes tracking the tiny plastic card in his fist. He didn't tell the guards to lower their guns. He just looked at Nia as if she were a bug he hadn't decided to crush yet. "Clear the room." Sung's voice didn't rise, but the floor seemed to shake. He dragged Nia by the arm, her feet barely touching the ground as he threw her into a soundproofed study. He slammed the SD card into a reader, and the room filled with Yuna's high, sharp giggle. "Once he chokes on the wine, the empire is mine," the recording hissed. Sung's face didn't twitch, but the veins in his neck turned into thick ropes. He picked up his phone, his thumb white as he pressed a button. "The wedding is over," he told the person on the other end. "Burn the flowers and lock the gates." Nia's legs finally gave out. She slumped against a mahogany desk, the room spinning in dizzy circles. Her mind flashed back to the dark closet where Devon used to lock her, the smell of old dust and the sound of a heavy bolt sliding home. She had saved Sung because she couldn't save herself back then, and the ghost of that old pain was screaming in her ears. She wasn't a hero. She was just tired of watching monsters win. Sung stepped toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He reached out, not for her throat, but to pull back the sleeve of her white waitress shirt. The jagged white scars on Nia's wrists caught the light. Sung froze, his fingers hovering over the marks of her past survival. He realized this girl hadn't come for his money or his crown. She had come because she knew what it felt like to be hunted. He looked at the scars, then looked at the door where his men waited with itchy trigger fingers. "You saved a devil," Sung whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "Now you belong to one." Sung stared at the digital file on his desk, the blue light turning his face into a mask of cold obsidian. The data didn't just list a name, it listed a haunting. He scrolled through police reports that had been lost and restraining orders that had been ignored, all tied to a man named Devon. Sung's jaw tightened until his teeth felt like they might shatter. He looked at Nia, who sat on the edge of a velvet chair, her spine as rigid as a frozen lake. "You didn't just disappear into the service industry, Nia," Sung's voice cut through the silence like a serrated blade. "You were erased." Nia's hands vanished into her sleeves, her thumbs digging into the old, raised tissue on her wrists. The room felt small, the walls closing in just like the cellar doors Devon used to lock from the outside. Being seen is a death sentence, Nia whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. I learned to be air, Sung. If he can't find me, he can't hurt the people I love. She had spent 3 years blending into the beige wallpaper of life, yet she had thrown it all away for a man who traded in blood. Sung leaned forward, his eyes tracking the frantic pulse in her throat. Then why did you choose the loudest way possible to save me? The question hung in the air, a trap she couldn't avoid. Because watching a murder is the only thing worse than being murdered, Nia said, the bitter taste of copper rising in her throat. Sung felt a strange, jagged sensation in his chest, a ghost of an emotion he had buried a decade ago. He had spent his life surrounded by men who would kill for a throne, yet this girl had walked into the fire with nothing but a uniform and a secret. He stood up, the movement fluid and dangerous. Pack nothing, Sung commanded. My fortress is the only place your shadow won't be followed. The mansion gates hissed shut behind them, a sound that should have felt like safety but felt like a cage. Nia stood in the marble foyer, the air smelling of expensive wax and cold steel. She looked at the security cameras tracking her every blink. She had traded a stalker for a warlord, a predator she could hide from for a predator who owned the lights. A flash of light blinded her, making her heart lurch into her teeth. Beverly Cooper stood near the grand staircase, her camera lowered but her eyes sharp enough to draw blood. The photo is already on the wire, darling, Beverly said, her voice a low, gravelly warning. Half the city thinks you're a gold-digging assassin, and the other half wants to know how you broke the unbreakable Sung. The photographer stepped closer, the smell of tobacco and chemicals clinging to her. You've lost the only weapon you had, Nia, your anonymity. Nia's stomach dropped. The world now had a map to her face. Before she could breathe, a maid approached, her face pale as bone, holding a small, rectangular box wrapped in black silk. Sung took the box, his movements slow and predatory. He flipped the lid to reveal a single black rose, its petals bruised and weeping a dark, sticky fluid. Tucked into the thorns was a note written in a script Nia recognized from 1,000 Nightmares. Found you. The rose wasn't a gift. It was a claim. Nia's knees turned to water, the phantom sensation of Devon's grip tightening around her throat. Sung crushed the flower in his fist, the dark juice staining his palm like fresh ink. He walked past my senses like they weren't there, Sung hissed, his eyes turning into twin voids of rage. He looked at Nia, seeing the way she shrank into herself, trying to become invisible again in a room that was now a spotlight. He realized that a waitress in his house was just a victim waiting for a sequence. To survive the monsters coming for her, she couldn't be a guest or a servant. Sung grabbed her chin, forcing her to look into the storm of his gaze. He's coming for a girl who doesn't exist anymore, Sung vowed. Tomorrow, I give you a name that carries a body count. The black rose sat on the mahogany desk like a charred heart, its scent thick with the smell of decay. Sung didn't look at the flower, he looked at Nia, whose knuckles were so white they looked like polished bone. Devon isn't just watching you, Nia. He's mocking my perimeter, Sung said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. He slid a thick stack of vellum across the desk. I don't offer protection to staff, and I don't hide runaways. I protect what belongs to me. Sign this, and for 365 days, you are the most untouchable woman in this city. Nia stared at the word marriage embossed in gold at the top of the page. Her stomach did a slow, sickening roll, the same way it had the night Devon broke her bedroom window. I came to you to stop a murder, not to sell my soul to a different devil, Nia whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. She turned to walk away, her heart hammering against her ribs, but Sung didn't move to stop her. He simply tapped a second file on his desk, revealing a grainy photo of a young girl leaving a community college library. Nia's sister. Devon sent a second gift to your sister's dorm this morning, Sung said, his eyes as cold as the deep Atlantic. He didn't leave a rose this time. He left a lock of her hair on her pillow. The air left Nia's lungs in a jagged gasp, and the room tilted on its axis. The trauma of her past wasn't a memory anymore. It was a living, breathing monster reaching for the only person she had left to love. She turned back to the desk, her hand trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the wood to stand. What is the price? She choked out, the bitter taste of copper filling her mouth. No intimacy. No private expectations, Sung stated, his words cutting through the air like a surgeon's blade. You play the devoted bride in every ballroom and boardroom until the world believes you are the air I breathe. In exchange, Devon disappears from the face of the earth, and your sister gets a security detail that could hold off an army. Nia picked up the fountain pen, the weight of it feeling like a loaded gun. She scrawled her name across the bottom, a jagged line of ink that felt like a permanent scar. She was safe, but as she looked into Sung's unreadable eyes, she realized she had just traded her invisibility for a crown made of barbed wire. The victory lasted less than a heartbeat before the intercom buzzed, a frantic tone that signaled a breach. "Sir, Yuna is on every news cycle," his head of security reported, his voice tight. "She's leaking medical records. Claims Nia is a delusional stalker with a history of institutionalization to explain away the recording." The trap snapped shut. If the city believed Nia was insane, the evidence against Yuna would vanish into thin air. Sung didn't flinch, his face a mask of predatory calm as he reached for his coat. "She thinks she's playing a game of whispers," he muttered, his eyes flashing with a lethal light. "I'm going to give her a scream." Sung grabbed Nia's hand, his grip firm and hot against her cold skin, and led her onto the mansion's grand balcony where a swarm of reporters waited below. He didn't wait for questions. He pulled Nia into the crook of his arm and leaned into the microphone. "My wedding was cancelled because I found the woman I truly love," Sung declared, his voice booming with an authority that silenced the crowd. "Nia isn't a witness. She is my future wife, and any lie told against her is a declaration of war against me." The flashbulbs erupted, 1,000 tiny suns blinding Nia as she realized the world was now watching her every move. Inside the quiet of the foyer, Sung slid a ring onto her finger, a diamond so large it felt heavy enough to break her hand. It wasn't a symbol of love. It was a cold, hard shield that marked her as his territory. "The world thinks we are in love, Nia," Sung whispered, his breath ghosting over her ear. "But remember, a crown only stays on your head as long as the king stays alive." He turned to leave, but stopped when a burner phone on the table vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "White looks better on you than black. See you at the altar." The silk of the emerald gown felt like cold water against Nia's skin, but the corset underneath was a cage of iron. She stood at the top of the grand ballroom stairs, the roar of the elite city crowd sounding like the ocean before a shipwreck. For years, she had survived by being the shadow in the corner, the waitress whose face no one remembered. Now, she was the centerpiece of a room filled with wolves in tuxedos, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every flash of the chandelier felt like Devon's camera, a reminder that the world finally knew where to find her. If she tripped now, she wasn't just losing her dignity, she was losing the only shield protecting her sister's life. Sung appeared at her side, his presence a sudden wall of heat in the drafty hall. He didn't offer a gentle touch, he clamped his hand onto her waist, his palm broad and steadying against the tremble of her hip. "Breathe, Nia," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that bypassed her ears and settled in her spine. "In this room, you aren't the prey. You are the hunter's wife." He led her down the stairs, his stride predatory and rhythmic, forcing her to match his pace. She caught her reflection in a floor-to-ceiling mirror, a goddess in green, but the white-knuckled grip she had on her silk clutch told the real story. Beverly Cooper lunged from the crowd, her lens clicking with the speed of a machine gun. "Look at the camera, Nia. Give the world the face of the woman who tamed the dragon." Beverly's sharp-edged voice cut through the music. The photographer didn't just take pictures. She captured the ownership in Sung's eyes, a look that would be on every front page by dawn. The plan was working, the power couple was born, but Nia felt the weight of the diamond on her finger growing heavier with every flash. The more the world believed the lie, the harder it would be to ever walk away from the man whose hand felt like a permanent brand on her skin. As they moved through the throng, Nia noticed a shift in the air that made the hair on her arms stand up. The men who used to look through her with hungry, hollow eyes now averted their gaze, their shoulders tensing as she passed. For the first time in her life, she didn't see lust or pity in the faces of powerful men. She saw the sharp, jagged edge of fear. She was no longer a victim to be hunted. She was a threat by association. But just as she began to feel the intoxicating pull of safety, a waiter bumped her arm, and the metallic scent of gun oil cut through the heavy perfume of the room. Nia's eyes darted to a loyal guest, a man Sung had greeted as a brother only moments before. The man's tuxedo jacket sat unevenly, the weighted sag of a holster visible only to someone who had spent a lifetime watching for hidden dangers. "Sung," she whispered, her voice a razor-thin line of steel. She didn't hesitate. She leaned into him as if for a kiss, her body shielding his chest while her hand pressed firmly against his ribs to signal the threat. The man in the blue tie, 10 o'clock. He's carrying more than just a toast. Sung's body went from silk to stone in a heartbeat, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the target with lethal precision. He didn't call for security. He simply pulled Nia closer, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in a way that felt dangerously real. The betrayal from his inner circle was a sting he knew well, but the fact that this invisible girl had seen the blade before it reached his back sent a shock through his system. He looked down at her, not as a contract partner or a pawn, but as a woman who was becoming the only person he could trust. The cold, calculated distance of their deal was evaporating, replaced by a heat that threatened to burn them both. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear in a gesture that looked like passion to the room but sounded like a vow to her. "You've saved me twice now, Nia," he murmured, his grip tightening until she could feel the thrum of his own racing pulse. "But every time you save my life, the price to let you go gets higher." Before she could answer, his lead security guard leaned in, whispering a single sentence that turned the golden ballroom into a tomb. "Sir, we just found the man in the blue tie. He wasn't working alone, and the back exit has been chained from the outside." The heavy iron doors of the fortress study clicked shut, sealing the world of guns and flashbulbs outside. Nia leaned against the cool wood, her chest heaving against the emerald silk that now felt like a shroud. On Sung's desk lay a bank ledger, left open as if by accident, showing a trail of massive wire transfers to a private medical facility. Nia's breath hitched as she traced the name of the beneficiary, her sister, Maya. For years, Nia had scrubbed floors and skipped meals to pay for Maya's care, yet here was the proof that the monstrous boss had quietly erased the debt with a single stroke of a pen. This man didn't just buy her safety, he had been buying her sister's life while Nia was still a stranger in a waitress vest. "Why?" Nia's voice was a jagged whisper that cut through the silence of the library. Sung didn't turn from the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the moon like a dark mountain. "Debt is a weight, Nia," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the marrow in her bones ache. "I wanted you to stand tall when you walked beside me, not crawl under the burden of a hospital's ledger." He turned, and for the first time, the predatory mask was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that made him look human. He was a man who had built a kingdom of gold and blood, yet his eyes reflected a soul that had never known a day of rest. Nia stepped into his space, the scent of expensive sandalwood and gunsmoke wrapping around her like a blanket. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed the back of his hand, the same hand that had crushed a black rose and ordered the deaths of men. "You've never had anyone to protect you, have you?" she asked, her heart hammering a rhythm she didn't recognize. Sung's fingers curled into hers, a grip that wasn't about ownership, but about a drowning man finding a lifeline. "Peace is a fairy tale for men like me," he confessed, his gaze dropping to her lips. In that moment, the contract was a lie, and the invisible girl realized she was falling for the one man who made her feel seen. The air between them thickened, the heat of their shared breath a silent promise in the dark room. But the silence was shattered by the shrill, violent vibration of Nia's phone on the desk. She froze, the bitter taste of copper flooding her mouth as she saw the unknown caller ID that had haunted her dreams for years. She answered, her fingers turning white around the device as a voice like grinding gravel filled the room. The dress looked expensive, Nia, Devon's voice hissed through the speaker. "But you're still wearing my marks under it. I'm coming to reclaim my property tonight." The phone slipped from Nia's hand, clattering onto the floor as the room seemed to tilt. The walls of the fortress, the guards, the diamonds, none of it mattered if Devon could still reach through the air and touch her soul. She looked at Sung, her eyes wide with the raw, jagged edges of a trauma that had never truly healed. She wasn't a queen, she was a rabbit in a hole, and the hounds were at the door. But Sung didn't look at her with pity. He looked at the phone as if he could kill the man on the other end with a single thought. Sung reached down and picked up the device, his eyes turning into twin shards of deadly, cold ice. He didn't speak to Nia, he spoke to the empty room, his voice a promise of total annihilation. "He thinks you are a prize to be won," Sung said, his knuckles cracking with a sound like a gunshot. "He doesn't realize that by threatening you, he assigned a death warrant for every man who shares his blood." He looked at Nia, his gaze so intense it felt like a brand, but before he could move, the house alarm began to wail, a high-pitched scream that meant the perimeter had already been breached. The phone on the floor vibrated again, a jagged buzz that sounded like a hornet trapped in a glass jar. Nia lunged for it, her vision blurring as a photo loaded on the screen. Her sister, Maya, sitting on a park bench, a bright red laser dot centered perfectly on her forehead. The background showed the city's clock tower, a public square only 10 minutes away. Nia's lungs turned to lead, the air refusing to enter as the old, familiar terror of Devon's shadow swallowed the room. She didn't scream. She simply bolted, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm against the marble as she headed for the heavy iron gates of the estate. She reached the perimeter, her fingers clawing at the cold steel bars, but a shadow fell over her that was heavier than the gate itself. Sung's hand slammed against the iron, his arm a solid bar of oak blocking her path. "Out of my way, Sung." Nia's voice was a raw, bleeding edge, her nails digging into the meat of his forearm. "He has her. He's going to do to her what he did to me because I ran." She could still feel the phantom heat of the radiator Devon had chained her to years ago, the smell of burning skin a permanent ghost in her mind. If Maya died, the last piece of Nia's soul would go into the dirt with her. Sung didn't flinch, his eyes two burning coals in the moonlight as he forced her back from the gate. "You run out there now, and you aren't saving her, you're just handing him a second trophy," he growled, his grip on her shoulders grounding her flailing panic. "You are mine now, Nia. In my world, that means your enemies don't just lose, they are erased." He pulled her back toward the house, his stride purposeful and lethal, leaving no room for her to argue. But as they entered the command center, a screen flickered to life, showing a bank transfer that made Nia's heart stop. The digital footprint didn't lead to a dark alley. It led straight back to Yuna's private offshore account. The ex-fiancé hadn't just gone into hiding. She had bought herself a monster, feeding Devon the location and the means to hunt Nia down. The betrayal was a perfect, jagged circle. The woman Sung almost married was now funding the man who had broken Nia's spirit. "She isn't just trying to discredit you anymore," Sung hissed, his thumb tracing the screen where Yuna's signature authorized the hit. "She's using your past to clean up her future." The tactical screens in the room glowed with red dots as Sung's men began arming themselves, the heavy clack-clack of magazines sliding into rifles filling the air. Sung turned to his lead captain, his face a mask of predatory stone. "Find the signal, lock down the square, and bring me Devon's head in a box," he commanded, his voice devoid of any human heat. He was a king preparing for a crusade, a man ready to burn the city to save a girl he had known for a week. But Nia stepped into the center of the room, her voice finally steady, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the monitors. "He won't show himself to your soldiers, Sung," Nia said, the whiteness of her knuckles the only sign of the war inside her. "He's a scavenger. He only comes out when he thinks the prey is alone and broken." She looked at the photo of her sister, then back at the man who had become her unexpected shield. "I have to be the bait. I have to walk into that square alone so he thinks he's finally won." Sung's jaw tightened until a muscle in his cheek pulsed like a ticking bomb. "I will not put you in his sight line," Sung roared, his hand slamming onto the tactical table. "I have spent my life losing things I care about. I won't watch you become a casualty of my war." But Nia didn't flinch, her gaze locking onto his with a strength that subverted every expectation he had of the invisible girl. She wasn't running from her trauma anymore. She was using it as a lure to draw the beast into the light. The silence in the room stretched thin, a wire vibrating before it snaps, as Sung realized he was no longer protecting a victim, but a partner. He leaned in close, his forehead resting against hers, the scent of gunpowder and desperation thick between them. "If you go, I am the shadow behind every breath you take," he whispered, his hand sliding into the small of her back to hide a GPS tracker beneath her silk dress. He stepped back, signaling his men to move out, but his eyes never left hers. "The moment he touches you, Nia, the world ends for him." As Nia turned to walk toward the waiting car, her phone chimed with a final text. "The clock is ticking, Nia. Don't be late for our reunion." The hum of the armored car's engine was the only thing keeping the silence from crushing Nia's chest. Inside the dim cabin, Sung stripped off his tactical vest, his shirt following, revealing a back that looked like a map of a war zone. Elaborate, dark ink spiraled across his skin, dragons entwined with thorns, each scale a testament to a life taken or a betrayal survived. Nia reached out, her fingers trembling as she traced a jagged scar that cut right through the head of a serpent. "Every mark is a debt paid in blood," Sung rasped, his back still turned, muscles rippling like shifting tectonic plates. The weight of his history pressed into the small space, a reminder that she wasn't just falling for a man, but for a legend built on a mountain of bones. Sung turned, his eyes searching hers for the flinch that usually came when people saw the monster beneath the suit. Instead, Nia stepped into the heat of his personal space, her hand moving from his scars to his heart. "I'm not here for the boss of the city, and I'm not here for the contract," she whispered, her voice a low, steady flame. "I want the man who looked at me in that ballroom and saw a person, not a tool. She was tired of being property, Devon's property, the state's property, or even Sung's protected asset. She needed to know if the heart beating under her palm was capable of loving a woman who had been broken into 1,000 jagged pieces. Sung's hand shot up, his fingers tangling in her hair, but his touch was a ghost of a caress. "I've spent 30 years inviting death to my table, Nia," he admitted, his voice cracking like dry earth. "I was never afraid to die until I saw you standing in that light, risking everything for a devil like me." The admission was a subversion of everything she knew about him. The invincible king was admitting he had a jugular, and she was the one holding the blade. He leaned down, and this time, there were no cameras, number 200 armed men, and no secrets. Their lips met in a collision of desperation and hope, a real kiss that tasted of salt and the looming shadow of the end. The moment of peace shattered when Sung pulled back, his face hardening into the mask of the general once more. He reached into a hidden compartment and pulled out a sleek, black subcompact pistol and a ceramic ring that housed a micro-tracker. "If you're going to be the bait, you have to be the predator too," he said, pressing the cold steel into her palm. He showed her how to thumb the safety, his hand steadying hers, but as she felt the weight of the weapon, a new realization hit her. This wasn't a win. He was arming her because he knew his own men might not be fast enough to stop the first bullet. "The tracker stays active even if they jam the phones," Sung explained, his eyes locking onto hers with a soul-shattering intensity. They were no longer two people trapped in a business arrangement. They were two survivors fused together by the heat of an oncoming war. Nia felt the heavy diamond on her other hand, the shield, and realized she would rather die with him than live another hour as a ghost. She gripped the weapon, the metal biting into her skin, ready to trade her life for the chance to finally stop running. But before she could speak, his radio hissed with a burst of static that made both of them freeze. "Boss, the signal just went live," the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, sounding like a death knell. "The exchange point isn't the park. They moved her to the rusted warehouse on the docks." The trap had shifted, moving from a public square to a kill zone where Sung's resources would be throttled by narrow corridors and blind corners. Devon had known they were tracking him and had led them into a maze of his own choosing. Sung grabbed his gear, his eyes turning back into the deadly, cold ice that had first terrified her. "The game is over," he said, checking his watch as the car roared toward the water. The warehouse smelled of rusted iron and the stagnant, salt-heavy breath of the docks. Nia stepped into the hollow gut of the building, her heels clicking against concrete slick with oil. Shadows stretched like reaching fingers, but she didn't shrink. She felt the cold weight of the pistol Sung had given her pressed against her thigh. In the center of the room, Devon stood under flickering yellow light, holding a flare gun to her sister's throat. Maya's eyes were wide, her mouth taped shut, her knuckles white where she was bound to a rusted chair. Nia's chest burned with the memory of the cellar, the feeling of being a bug under Devon's heel, but as she reached the circle of light, she stopped. "Look at you, all dressed up in a monster's jewels," Devon sneered, his voice the same oily rasp that had haunted her nightmares. He stepped closer, the flare gun glinting, expecting her to tremble, to beg, to become the invisible girl he had broken. "You're still just property, Nia. You just traded a small cage for a gold one." Nia felt the stinging sweat on her brow, but she didn't look away. She stood like a pillar of stone. "I am not invisible anymore, Devon," she said, her voice a low, lethal hum that made him flinch. "And I am nobody's property." Devon's face twisted into a snarl, his finger tightening on the trigger, but a red laser dot suddenly bloomed on his forehead. The skylights shattered in a rain of jagged glass as Sung's men descended on ropes like dark angels of death. The air erupted with the rhythmic thump-thump of suppressed rifles, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos in strobes of violent light. Sung breached the main doors, his movement a blur of surgical precision as he cleared the path toward Maya. Nia lunged for her sister, but a shadow detached itself from a shipping container. Yuna, her face a mask of ruined beauty, holding a silver revolver aimed straight at Nia's head. "If I can't have the Empire, I'll take his heart," Yuna shrieked, her finger white against the trigger. A shot rang out, but it wasn't Nia who fell. Sung had thrown himself into the line of fire, his shoulder jerking as the bullet tore through the silk of his suit. He didn't stop, his own weapon barked once, and Yuna's revolver clattered away as she collapsed into the dark. Sung reached Maya, slicing through her zip ties with a combat knife just as a sniper's nest on the mezzanine sparked with a new muzzle flash. The bullet grazed Sung's temple, drawing a line of bright, hot crimson across his cheek. Devon scrambled for a fallen rifle, his eyes crazed as he realized his leverage was gone. He looked up to find Nia standing over him, her silhouette framed by the smoke and fire of the unfolding war. The man who had been her god of fear now looked like a shivering rat in the dirt. "This is for every night I spent in the dark," Nia whispered, the bitter taste of copper on her tongue. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger, and the shadow that had darkened her life for 3 years finally dissolved into the dust of the warehouse floor. Sung stood up, Maya shielded behind his broad frame, his face splattered with blood and oil. He looked at the carnage, the bodies of his rivals, the weeping women, the smell of cordite and ozone, and then he looked at Nia. She was standing in the center of the bloodbath, her emerald dress stained, her eyes reflecting a violence she should never have known. He had won the war, but as he watched Nia's hand tremble while she lowered the gun, a new kind of terror gripped him. He had built a fortress to keep her safe, but he had only succeeded in bringing her into the heart of the butcher shop. The warehouse fell into a ringing, hollow silence as the last of the shooters were neutralized. Sung walked toward Nia, his boots crunching on the glass, but he didn't reach for her with the grip of a boss. He saw the way she looked at her sister, the way the invisible girl had been replaced by a soldier, and the weight of his crown felt like a lead shroud. He realized that as long as he sat on the throne, Nia would always be a target in someone else's sights. "It's over," he said, but his eyes were fixed on the exit, where the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the smoke. The sirens wailed in the distance, a low, mourning sound that signaled the end of the night's carnage. Nia stood on the warehouse pier, the wind whipping her torn emerald dress against legs that felt like lead. She watched Sung's men stack the black body bags, the final inventory of a life she could no longer breathe in. She had spent years running from a monster who wanted to own her, and she realized now that being a queen was just another way of being property. She reached for the heavy diamond on her finger, the metal cold and biting, ready to slide it off and return to the shadows where no one knew her name. If she stayed, she was a target. If she left, she was alone, but the silence of the docks offered a peace the mansion never could. Inside the scorched remains of the office, the council of the underworld waited, their faces like stone as they watched Sung bleed. He held the marriage contract in his hand, the paper stained with Devon's blood and Yuna's failure. "The girl saved your life, Sung," the oldest councilman rasped, his eyes fixed on the power vacuum. "Keep her as a trophy, but the business requires a king who doesn't bleed for a waitress." Sung looked at the signatures, the jagged lines Nia had written when she was a terrified girl with nothing to lose. He didn't answer with words. He gripped the vellum and ripped it down the center, the sound of tearing paper louder than any gunshot. Nia walked into the room just as the pieces hit the floor, her breath hitching as she saw her freedom fluttering in the dust. "The contract is dead," Sung announced, his voice a low, tectonic shift that made the councilmen reach for their hidden blades. "I'm leaving the chair, and I'm taking the only thing in this room worth keeping." He didn't look back at the throne or the maps of the city's veins. He looked at Nia with a raw, naked honesty that made her pulse thunder. He was handing over the keys to a kingdom, but the men in the shadows weren't going to let a king retire without a final, lethal tax. "You can't just walk away from the dragon, Sung," the elder hissed, the safety on a weapon clicking in the dark. "The Empire is a blood-in, blood-out arrangement." Sung stepped toward the council, his stature dwarfing them as he tossed a thick ledger onto the table, the legitimate holdings, the clean money, and the titles to the city's steel. "It's all yours," Sung countered, his voice like grinding stones. "Beverly Cooper's brother takes the oversight. He's clean, and he's smart enough to keep you rich and out of prison." The greed in the room flickered, the hunger for the gold momentarily outweighing the hunger for blood, but the air remained thick with the scent of an impending strike. He grabbed Nia's hand, his palm rough and hot, and pulled her toward the exit before the council could change their minds. They didn't take the armored fleet or the security detail. They took a single, nondescript car and drove until the city's skyline was a smudge of gray in the rearview mirror. Nia watched the miles melt away, her knuckles slowly losing their whiteness as the weight of the crown lifted from her head. She had spent her life trying to be invisible to survive, but Sung had taught her how to be seen and still be safe. The trauma of the cellar was a ghost that finally stopped screaming, replaced by the rhythmic sound of the tires on the open road. Months later, the smell of cordite and salt-heavy docks was a fading nightmare, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of the Pacific. Nia stood on a secluded stretch of white sand, the hem of a simple white sundress dancing around her ankles. There were no cameras, number 200 armed men, and no secrets hidden in her sleeves. Sung stood before her in a linen shirt, the tattoos on his arms peeking out like stories from a past life that no longer had the power to hurt them. He didn't offer her a contract or a shield. He offered her a plain gold band and a promise that had no expiration date. "No bosses," Nia whispered, her voice steady and clear against the crashing of the waves. "No waitresses," Sung replied, his eyes reflecting the soft gold of the setting sun. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for the first time, the weight didn't feel like a cage. As they turned to watch the horizon, a single figure watched from the dunes, a man in a dark suit with a phone in his hand. He looked at the couple, then at the photo on his screen, before turning his back and walking away into the trees. The invisible waitress and the deadly boss had finally found their peace, but the world they left behind never stopped looking.